Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're carving into a story as monumental and controversial as the granite faces themselves. We're journeying to the Black Hills of South Dakota to uncover the epic, often troubled, history of Mount Rushmore, a shrine to democracy for some, a scar on sacred land for others. This isn't just about giant presidential heads, it's about ambition, art, politics, and the very American act of blasting mythology into a mountainside. So, before we get comfortable with this colossal tale, take a moment to like this video and hit that subscribe button, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the complexities of history. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global community gathering for these stories. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's monumental journey together. Before the drills and dynamite arrived, the mountain now known as Mount Rushmore stood in quiet majesty, untouched by chisels or presidents. To most Americans in the early 20th century, it was just another granite peak in the rugged Black Hills of South Dakota. But to the Lakota Sioux, it was sacred. They called it Paha Sapa, the heart of everything that is, a spiritual center, not a stage. The Black Hills had been granted to the Lakota in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, a legal promise that the land would remain theirs forever. But forever proved brief. After gold was discovered in the region just years later, prospectors flooded in and the US government reneged on the treaty. The hills were seized and the Lakota were pushed aside. Their sacred spaces sold, mined, and eventually dynamited. By the 1920s, the United States was craving myth. The trauma of World War I had passed, but a new kind of identity crisis had emerged. One defined by modernity, rapid industrial change, and the search for a unifying national story. Against that backdrop, a South Dakota historian named Don Robinson came up with a bold idea: carve giant figures of American heroes into a mountainside to attract tourism and celebrate the country's greatness. Robinson originally envisioned Western figures: Lewis and Clark, Red Cloud, Buffalo Bill. But once Gutzon Borglum, a fiercely ambitious sculptor with a love for grandeur and nationalism, joined the project, the scope shifted. Borglum proposed something far more dramatic: the faces of 4 US presidents carved at monumental scale into the granite cliffs. The mountain chosen for the project was not selected by accident. It offered solid granite, high visibility, and favorable sun exposure. But it also stood on land taken from indigenous people, a fact ignored or dismissed by the project's boosters. At the time, the mountain didn't even carry its now famous name in Lakota tradition. Mount Rushmore was a colonial label coined after a visiting New York lawyer in 1885. The land, once full of tribal stories and ancient rhythms, was about to become something else entirely: a monument to empire, ambition, and the American mythos. The face of the mountain was blank, but not empty. What do you think about the decision to carve such a monument on land with such a contested history? Let me know your initial thoughts. The man who would give Mount Rushmore its colossal faces was no ordinary artist. Gutzon Borglum was as much a showman as a sculptor, a man obsessed with legacy, nationalism, and monumentality. When he arrived in South Dakota in the mid-1920s, he wasn't looking to carve a mountain. He was looking to carve his name into history. Born in 1867 to Danish immigrants in Idaho, Borglum studied art in Paris and was heavily influenced by classical sculpture and the romantic nationalism of 19th century Europe. He admired size, symbolism, and the idea that art should inspire civic pride. His work had already appeared in public spaces across the US, and he had earned a reputation for bold, large-scale projects. But it was his brief, controversial involvement with the Confederate Memorial at Stone Mountain in Georgia that defined much of his early fame and notoriety. That project fell apart amid funding issues and creative disagreements. Borglum left the South in a storm of accusations and broken contracts, but he took with him something valuable: experience with granite, explosives, and the sheer mechanics of mountain carving. When South Dakota's Doane Robinson came calling with his idea to boost tourism through the monumental sculpture, Borglum saw an opportunity to start over, bigger, and this time under his full artistic control. But Borglum didn't want to carve regional heroes. He saw something grander, a shrine to American democracy, featuring presidents who, in his view, shaped the nation's destiny. He chose George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt, each representing a different pillar of the Republic: founding, expansion, preservation, and development. Borglum's involvement transformed Mount Rushmore from a state-level tourism gimmick into a federal monument project. He had powerful connections. Even President Calvin Coolidge gave his blessing, and he knew how to secure funding, attract media attention, and pitch patriotic symbolism. For Borglum, art was a tool of myth-making, but his vision was also wrapped in controversy. He held strong nationalist beliefs, and his past flirtations with white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan during the Stone Mountain Project have cast a long shadow over his legacy. Still, his skill was undeniable, and when he looked at the Black Hills, he didn't see rock. He saw immortality waiting to be carved. All right, if you're intrigued by the complex figure of Gutzon Borglum and the monumental task ahead, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps these stories reach a wider audience. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing so for more fascinating historical deep dives. Mount Rushmore was never sculpted with hammers and chisels alone. It was blasted, drilled, and jackhammered into existence with precision and violence, a controlled chaos orchestrated by Gutzon Borglum and a crew of over 400 men. From 1927 to 91, the mountain rang daily with explosions as granite gave way to vision. Work began with George Washington's face. Chosen both for symbolism and practical reasons, Washington's likeness, at over 60 feet tall, would become the template for the rest. But carving a mountain isn't like shaping marble. Granite is hard, unforgiving, and prone to fractures. To make it work, Borglum and his team relied on an unusual blend of artistry and engineering. The process began with dynamite. Blasting crews used carefully calculated charges to remove massive amounts of rock, shaving away the mountain's bulk in layers. After the blasts, drillers and point men would climb scaffolding hundreds of feet above the ground to refine the shapes with jackhammers and hand tools. Men dangled from ropes, carving eyebrows and noses from sheer cliffs. It was skilled labor, dangerous and often deafening, but also oddly intimate. Each face took years to complete, and mistakes could not be undone. Despite the scale, the tools were shockingly ordinary. Workers used basic equipment powered by compressors and ingenuity. Safety was a concern, but remarkably, no one was killed during the 14 years of construction, a fact Borglum proudly touted. Many of the workers were miners, stonecutters, or unemployed laborers from the Great Depression. For them, it was a job, a paycheck, and a piece of history. Progress was slow and funding was inconsistent. The Great Depression hit just as the project got underway, leading to delays and the constant need for federal support. Borglum, ever the political operator, secured New Deal funding and used patriotic rhetoric to keep momentum alive. As each president's face emerged, first Washington, then Jefferson, Lincoln, and finally Roosevelt, the mountain transformed into a national myth. It wasn't just about likeness, it was about idealism. These were not men, they were symbols, carved from the same rock as the country's founding myths. But behind every blast and chisel stroke was a contradiction. A monument to freedom, carved into stolen land by men working through economic despair. To millions of visitors, Mount Rushmore is a patriotic symbol, a shrine to democracy carved in stone. But to the Lakota Sioux, it is a wound. The monument was carved into the Black Hills, or Pahasapa, a place held sacred by the Lakota long before the first dynamite charge ever echoed through the cliffs. For them, this wasn't just granite, it was holy. The 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie had guaranteed the Black Hills to the Lakota people in perpetuity, But when gold was discovered in the region just a few years later, the U.S. government tore up that agreement. Soldiers came, settlers followed. The land was seized, and with it, the heart of Lakota cultural and spiritual life. By the time Gutzon Borglum arrived with blueprints and scaffolding, the Lakota had already lost more than territory. They had lost trust in every treaty ever signed. And then, as if to twist the knife, the faces of 4 American presidents were chosen to be carved into the hills, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, 2 men associated with indigenous displacement and the expansion of settler colonialism. From the Lakota perspective, Mount Rushmore isn't a tribute, it's a desecration. It represents broken promises, land theft, and the ongoing erasure of native sovereignty, and it stands in contrast to the nearby peak of Thunderhead Mountain, where another colossal carving, the Crazy Horse Memorial, was later commissioned by Lakota leaders as a counter-monument, still unfinished but growing year by year. The Lakota weren't consulted when Mount Rushmore was proposed. Their protests were ignored. Their cultural claims to the land were overridden by federal courts and public opinion. Even today, they continue to assert their rights through activism, legal challenges, and symbolic acts. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruling in United States Sioux Nation acknowledged that the Black Hills were taken illegally. The Lakota were awarded compensation, but they've refused the money. They want the land back. So while Mount Rushmore may seem silent and immovable, it is layered with unresolved conflict. It is not just a monument, it is a mirror. And depending on where you stand, what you see reflected can look like pride or pain. The face of George Washington was the first to emerge from the granite, a 60-foot portrait of the man often called the father of the nation. Gutzon Borglum chose Washington to symbolize the birth of the United States, its revolution, its ideals, and its earliest identity as a new republic. But as the granite was blasted away, the face that appeared was more than a likeness. It was mythology made stone. Washington's carving began in 1930 and set the tone for the rest of the monument. His face required years of work, from explosives to fine chiseling, and was unveiled in stages. Borglum insisted that the facial expression project calm authority, a vision of timeless leadership. The symmetry had to be flawless. The nose alone was over 20 feet long. Next came Thomas Jefferson, originally intended to be carved to Washington's right, but the granite proved too unstable and the partially carved face had to be blasted away. Jefferson was relocated to Washington's left and construction restarted from scratch. It was a setback that cost time, money, and morale. But eventually Jefferson's visage appeared, staring with distant determination over the Black Hills. Jefferson was chosen to represent the expansion of the United States, particularly through the Louisiana Purchase. But his inclusion carries weight beyond politics. Jefferson was a complex figure, a writer of liberty, yet an owner of slaves. A visionary Democrat, yet a man who viewed indigenous lands as territory to be absorbed by the growing American state. Carving these 2 founders into Lakota sacred land was not just symbolic, it was inflammatory. Washington had overseen military campaigns against native tribes. Jefferson had authored policies that encouraged westward settlement, laying the groundwork for decades of displacement. Yet to many Americans, these men stood for reason, freedom, and the Enlightenment values that shaped the Republic. Borglum saw in them a pantheon of American gods. He wanted their faces to outlast centuries, to gaze upon the nation's future with ageless authority. And with Washington and Jefferson complete, Mount Rushmore had begun to take its shape, a sculpture not only of 4 men, but of the story America tells about itself. Whether you see founders or conquerors depends on which side of history you're standing. With Washington and Jefferson complete, Mount Rushmore was already becoming a national icon, but Gutzon Borglum wasn't finished. To complete his vision of America's evolution, he turned next to Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, 2 presidents chosen not for their proximity to the founding, but for how they steered the country through crisis and transformation. Abraham Lincoln, the third face carved, was Borglum's personal favorite. He admired Lincoln as a unifier, the man who preserved the Union during the Civil War and ended the institution of slavery, to Borglum, Lincoln symbolized the preservation of the nation. His face, somber and sunken-eyed, presented the weight of leadership during the country's darkest hour. Carving Lincoln's face into the granite took years, from 1937 to 1939, and required immense attention to detail. His deeply set eyes, high cheekbones, and signature beard were etched slowly, often by hand with pneumatic hammers. Then came Theodore Roosevelt, a more unconventional choice at the time. Borglum selected him to represent the development of modern America, its industrial might, economic ambition, and growing global presence. Roosevelt had been a personal friend of Borglum's, and his progressive reforms, trust-busting campaigns, and environmental conservation efforts made him, in Borglum's eyes, the ideal figure of dynamic leadership. Roosevelt's face, carved snugly between Lincoln and Jefferson, was a technical challenge due to its recessed position and thick-rimmed spectacles, a detail carefully shaped into the stone using metal rods to suggest the lenses. His inclusion was controversial. Critics argued that Roosevelt hadn't yet earned a place alongside the other giants of American history, but Borglum insisted and prevailed. Together, Lincoln and Roosevelt completed the four-part narrative: birth, expansion, preservation, development. It was a chronological march through American ambition, as seen through the eyes of its most powerful leaders. But each of these men, particularly Lincoln and Roosevelt, had complicated legacies involving indigenous policy, imperialism, and internal strife. Still, their faces, now larger than life, were intended to be permanent. They were carved to endure thousands of years, and as their stone expressions took shape, Mount Rushmore stopped being just a work of art. It became a symbol not of who these men were, but of what the country wanted them to be. Building Mount Rushmore wasn't just an artistic feat, it was a political hustle. From its inception, the project was entangled in the currents of American nationalism, economic desperation, and bureaucratic red tape. Carving four colossal faces into a mountain required more than vision. It required money, a lot of it, and Gutzon Borglum was relentless in chasing every dollar. When work began in 1927, the economy was still booming. But just 2 years later, the Great Depression hit and funding dried up across the country. Infrastructure projects collapsed, banks failed, and breadlines formed. Yet Mount Rushmore kept going. Why? Because Borglum understood the power of spectacle and the politics of pride. He pitched the monument as more than a tribute to presidents. He sold it as a shrine to democracy, a symbol of hope in a time of despair. He lobbied Congress, courted presidents, and spoke to anyone who would listen. Borglum wasn't just an artist, he was a propagandist, and Mount Rushmore was his stage. In the 1930s, the federal government, under Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, began pouring money into public works. Borglum secured federal funds through the National Park Service, which transformed the monument from a regional curiosity into a national project. The idea of carving American greatness into a mountain suddenly became an economic lifeline, creating jobs, boosting tourism, and stirring patriotic feeling. But the fundraising process wasn't smooth. Borglum clashed constantly with oversight boards, resisted creative compromises, and demanded full artistic control. He often exaggerated progress to secure more money, and even tried to expand the project beyond the four faces, proposing full torsos, an entablature, and a grand hall of records behind the heads. These were never completed. Public support was mixed. Many were proud, seeing the project as a proof that America could endure and build even in hard times. But critics saw it as wasteful, especially when people were starving. Others questioned the political motives behind choosing these particular presidents. All white, all male, all emblematic of expansionist policies. Still, the money kept coming. The dream, though expensive and flawed, marched on. For Borglum, every dollar raised was a vote of faith, not just in his monument, but in the American myth it was meant to immortalize. By the late 1930s, Mount Rushmore was taking shape. 3 presidents complete, a 4th underway, and the scaffolding still rising. But then, in March of 1941, the monument's creator, Gutzon Borglum, died suddenly from complications following surgery. He was 73 years old. The man who had dreamed, fought, and blasted this vision into stone was gone, and the project was left without its driving force. Borglum's death sent a wave of uncertainty through the project. He hadn't just been the sculptor, he had been the architect, the fundraiser, the public face, and the visionary who tied it all together. Without him, there was no one who held the same combination of artistic clarity and political savvy. There were blueprints, yes, there were plaster models, but the energy was gone. His son, Lincoln Borglum, took over the project, a quiet, dedicated man who had worked under his father's supervision for years. He was capable and committed, but far less grandiose, while Gutzon dreamed of full torsos, inscriptions, and elaborate finishing details. Lincoln took a more practical approach. With time running out and funding tight, he focused on completing Roosevelt's face and securing the site. Then came another blow, World War II. As America turned its attention overseas, priorities shifted. Federal funding was reallocated to the war effort. National sentiment moved from monuments to mobilization. Suddenly, there were more urgent things to build than statues. By October 31st, 1941, the work officially stopped. The carvings were left as they were. Incomplete by Borglum's original design, but still monumental, the planned Hall of Records, meant to house American documents and ideals, remained a hidden chamber behind Lincoln's head, unfinished and unused. Only decades later would a sealed repository of historical documents be placed there. And yet, even in its incomplete state, Mount Rushmore stood as a finished idea. 4 presidential faces gazed out over the Black Hills, not quite what Borglum had envisioned, but powerful enough to become an icon. Borglum's death changed the mountain. It froze the dream in place. The monument, once alive with ambition, became solid, static and silent, much like the stone it was carved from. Today, Mount Rushmore looms as one of the most recognizable landmarks in the United States, a towering symbol of national pride, tourist fascination and political complexity. To some, it is a breathtaking celebration of American ideals. To others, it is a painful reminder of the cost of empire. Its meaning shifts, depending on who you ask. More than 2 million people visit the site each year, gazing up at the 60-foot faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln and Roosevelt. They come for photographs, for patriotism and for the sheer awe of the engineering. But beneath the surface, the legacy of Mount Rushmore is far from simple. The monument has become a lightning rod in conversations about history, race, land rights and national identity. Critics argue that it glorifies presidents who oversaw the expansion of the United States at the direct expense of Native American nations, carving their faces into Lakota sacred land that was seized in violation of federal treaties, is seen by many as a lasting injustice. For the Lakota, Mount Rushmore is not a monument to liberty, it's a scar. At the same time, the monument has been fiercely defended by those who see it as a testament to American perseverance, a product of ingenuity and grit during the Great Depression, and a tribute to leadership. It has appeared in films, advertisements, textbooks and political rallies, often as a shorthand for America itself. Even presidents have weighed in. Ronald Reagan called it a monument to American exceptionalism. Barack Obama visited the site and acknowledged its beauty, while noting its contradictions. Activists have protested there. Tourists have proposed marriage there. It is a place of pilgrimage, both sacred and contested. Meanwhile, the unfinished Hall of Records, tucked behind Lincoln's head, now holds copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and a short biography of Borglum. They rest in a titanium vault, sealed inside a mountain, meant for future civilizations to find. In the end, Mount Rushmore is not just a sculpture, it is a story carved in granite, edited by history and debated with every generation, a national myth, towering and incomplete, just like the country it was meant to represent. What an incredible and complicated piece of history. Mount Rushmore is so much more than just giant faces on a mountain. What does it symbolize to you? And how do you think we should remember such complex monuments? I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the story of Mount Rushmore. If you found this exploration of American ambition and its consequences compelling, please give this video a like. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the monumental moments of the past. Until then, keep questioning and stay curious.